The silence in the first-class cabin of Flight 492 was deafening, broken only by the hum of the auxiliary power unit and the frantic tapping of 50 smartphones recording the scene. Captain Richard Sterling, a man with 20 years of flying experience and an ego the size of the Boeing 707, he commanded, stood over seat 1A, his face a mask of disdain. He pointed a trembling finger at the man in the hoodie, a man he had just loudly declared unfit to breathe the same recycled air as his VIP passengers. Sterling thought he was clearing out trash. He didn't know he was staring down the barrel of the United States Federal Aviation Administration. He didn't know that the man in seat 1A wasn't just a passenger. He was the man who signed Sterling's license. And in about 4 minutes, Sterling's life was going to end, not with a bang, but with a badge. The rain at JFK International Airport was relentless, a grey sheet of water hammering against the tarmac that turned the world outside Terminal 4 into a blurred watercolor painting. Inside the cockpit of the Boeing 707-300ER, Captain Richard Sterling checked his watch for the 3rd time in a minute. They were already 40 minutes behind schedule. Richard was a legacy pilot. His father had flown for Pan Am, his grandfather for the Army Air Corps. He had the jawline of a movie star, the silver-streaked hair of a statesman, and the patience of a starving shark. To Richard, the cockpit wasn't just a job. It was a throne room. He was the king of the sky, and he ran his flight deck with a terrifying militaristic precision. "Fuel load is confirmed, Captain," the first officer. A young man named Timothy Leclerc said tentatively. Timothy was 28 sharp and terrified of Richard. "Took them long enough," Richard snapped, adjusting his epaulets. "What about the manifest? I saw the VIP list. We have Senator Corcoran on board and the CEO of Oakhaven Tech. I want a smooth ride. No bumps, no delays, and absolutely no riffraff in the forward cabin. I'm up for my seniority review next month, Tim. I want perfection." "Yes, Captain. Boarding is nearly complete. Just waiting on a late arrival for 1A. Richard frowned. Seat 1A was the prime spot. Usually reserved for the highest-tier flyers or heavy-hitting politicians. "Who is it?" Timothy glanced at the iPad. "Name is Marcus Hayes. No title listed. Just a last-minute full-fare purchase. Paid in cash at the counter, apparently." Richard scoffed. "Cash at the counter, right? Probably some lottery winner or a rapper's entourage. Keep an eye on it." Richard left the cockpit to do his final walk-through of the cabin. It was his ritual. He wanted to make sure the first-class cabin looked pristine before he locked himself away. He walked past the rows of lie-flat seats, nodding charmingly to Senator Corcoran, who was already sipping a mimosa. "Smooth sailing today, Senator," Richard promised, with a practiced smile. "Good to hear, Captain Sterling," the senator replied. Richard felt good. He was in his element. Then he saw him, the late arrival for 1A. The man walking down the jet bridge didn't look like a senator. He didn't look like a CEO. He was a tall black man, broad-shouldered, wearing a charcoal grey hoodie with the hood pulled up, slightly loose-fitting joggers and heavy noise-cancelling headphones around his neck. He carried a battered leather duffel bag that looked like it had survived a war zone. He moved with a quiet, unassuming confidence, eyes scanning the cabin. He stopped at 1A, tossed his duffel into the overhead bin with practiced ease, and sat down. Richard stiffened. The sight offended his sensibilities. This was first class. This was where the elite sat. This man looked like he had just walked off a basketball court or out of a subway station. It was visually jarring against the champagne flutes and Italian suits surrounding him. Richard signaled to the lead flight attendant, Sarah, a veteran of the skies, who knew Richard's temper well. She hurried over to the galley where Richard was fuming. "Sarah!" Richard hissed, his voice low, but laced with venom. "Who is that in 1A? "That's Mr. Hayes, Captain," Sarah said, glancing at the manifest. "He's the late arrival." "He looks like he's lost," Richard muttered, peering around the curtain. "Look at him, hooded joggers. He's making the senator uncomfortable." Sarah glanced back. Senator Corcoran was reading a newspaper, completely ignoring Mr. Hayes. "The senator seems fine, Richard. Mr. Hayes has a valid ticket. He was polite when he boarded." "It's about standards, Sarah," Richard snapped, his face reddening. "We are a premium airline. We sell an image. People pay $10,000 for these seats to be away from the chaos. That man, he doesn't fit the profile. He looks suspicious." "Suspicious?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Captain, he's just sitting there." "He paid cash," Tim said. "Last minute." Richard said, his mind racing, connecting dots that didn't exist. "Drug money? Or fraud? I don't like it. He's degrading the VIP experience. I want you to go ask him for his boarding pass again. Check his ID, make sure he actually belongs here." Sarah sighed. She knew fighting Richard was useless, but this felt wrong. "Captain, the gate agent's already checked." "Do it, Sarah, or I will." Sarah smoothed her skirt and walked into the aisle. She approached 1A. The man, Marcus Hayes, was looking out the window watching the rain. He turned as she approached. His eyes were calm, deep, and intelligent. "Mr. Hayes?" Sarah asked gently. "Yes." His voice was a deep baritone, polite but brief. "I'm so sorry to bother you, sir. Could I just see your boarding pass one more time? There was a glitch in our system." Marcus held her gaze for a second too long, as if he knew exactly what the glitch was. He didn't argue. He pulled a crisp boarding pass from his pocket and handed it to her. "1A, Marcus Hayes," he said. Sarah checked it. It was legitimate. Platinum status, actually, though the system didn't show his history, which was odd. "Thank you, sir. Can I get you a drink before takeoff?" "Water, please. No ice." Sarah returned to the galley where Richard was waiting, arms crossed. "He's legit, Captain. Boarding pass matches. He's platinum." Richard's eyes narrowed. He didn't like being wrong, and he especially didn't like the way Marcus was sitting there, so relaxed, so unbothered, as if he owned the plane. It triggered something ugly in Richard, a mix of prejudice and an obsessive need for control. To Richard, Marcus was an anomaly, a stain on his perfect manifest. Platinum, likely a system error or a stolen mileage account, Richard grumbled. "I'm going to make a call to the gate. I want his background checked." "Richard, we're already late," Sarah warned. "If you delay us for this—" "I am the captain," Richard growled, stepping closer to her. I am responsible for the safety and comfort of everyone on this bird. If I say he's a risk to the comfort of the VIPs, he's gone. Unfit for travel." Richard turned and stared at the back of Marcus's head. He wasn't going to let this go. The god complex of the cockpit had taken the wheel. The aircraft doors were closed. The fasten seatbelt sign pinged on. But the engines of Flight 492 remained at a low idle. The plane wasn't moving. In Seat 1A, Marcus Hayes took a sip of his water. He pulled a small leather-bound notebook from his hoodie pocket and clicked a pen. He wrote down the time, 10:42 a.m. Pushback delayed. He glanced at the flight attendant, Sarah, who looked flushed and anxious near the cockpit door. He wrote, "Cabin crew appears stressed. Communication breakdown likely." Marcus wasn't just a passenger. He wasn't a rapper, and he wasn't a drug dealer. Marcus Hayes was the newly appointed Director of Field Operations for the FAA, reporting directly to the administrator in Washington. He was on a ghost ride, a random, unannounced audit of airline protocols specifically targeting high complaint routes. And this route, New York to London, commanded by Captain Richard Sterling, had flagged 3 complaints in the last 6 months regarding unprofessional conduct. Marcus had hoped the complaints were exaggerated. He had hoped for a boring flight. Suddenly, the cockpit door burst open. Captain Richard Sterling emerged not with the professional grace of a pilot, but with the storming stride of a bouncer. He wasn't wearing his hat. His face was set in a hard grimace. He walked straight to Seat 1A. The cabin went quiet. Senator Corcoran lowered his newspaper. The tech CEO took off his headphones. Richard stood over Marcus, blocking the overhead light. "Sir," Richard said, his voice loud enough to carry to row 5. He didn't use the polite "sir" of customer service. He used the "sir" of a police officer about to make an arrest. Marcus slowly capped his pen. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Yes, Captain. I need to see your identification. Now." Marcus stayed seated. "I showed my boarding pass and ID at the gate and again to your flight attendant. Is there a problem?" "The problem," Richard said, leaning down, invading Marcus's personal space, "is that I have reason to believe you are in violation of our dress code and conduct policy for the first-class cabin." A murmur went through the cabin. Dress code. In 2024, people flew in pajamas all the time. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "My hoodie. It's cashmere, and I haven't said a word to anyone. How is my conduct in violation?" "You're making the other passengers uncomfortable." Richard lied smoothly, gesturing vaguely behind him. "We have high-profile clients on this flight, VIPs. Your appearance and your demeanor are not fit for this cabin. I've made a command decision." "And what decision is that?" Marcus asked, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerously calm. "I'm moving you," Richard said, pointing toward the back of the plane. "I have a seat in economy comfort. You'll be more at home there. Grab your bag." It was a test, a humiliation ritual. Richard expected the man to explode, to shout, to curse. That would give Richard the excuse to kick him off entirely. He wanted a reaction. He wanted a reason. But Marcus didn't shout. He didn't move. He simply stared at Richard Sterling with a look of profound disappointment. "Captain," Marcus said softly, "I paid full fare for this seat. I am not moving, and I strongly suggest you return to the cockpit and push this plane back. You are already 45 minutes late." Richard's face turned a violent shade of red. He felt his authority slipping. The passengers were watching. The senator was watching. If he backed down now, he looked weak. "Listen to me, boy," Richard snarled, the racial undertones slipping out, sharp and undeniable. "I am the captain of this vessel. My word is law. You are unfit for VIP status. You don't belong here. Now you can walk to the back, or I can have law enforcement drag you off this plane in handcuffs for disobeying a flight crew member. It's your choice." Sarah, the flight attendant, stepped forward, horrified. "Captain, please." "Quiet, Sarah," Richard barked, not looking at her. He kept his eyes locked on Marcus. "Well, what's it going to be?" Marcus sighed. It was a heavy, weary sound. He reached into his pocket. Richard flinched, stepping back. "Hands where I can see them." Marcus moved slowly. He didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out his phone. He unlocked it and placed it on the armrest, screen up. Then he looked at Richard. "Call them," Marcus said. "What? Call law enforcement," Marcus said. "Call port authority. In fact, call the airport duty manager too, because if I leave this seat, Captain Sterling, I promise you this plane will not take off today, and you will never fly a commercial airliner again." Richard laughed. It was a dry, incredulous laugh. "Is that a threat? You think you have power here? You're nobody." Richard turned to the galley phone and snatched the receiver. He punched in the code for the gate agent. "Get port authority on the jet bridge." Richard shouted into the phone, his voice echoing through the silent cabin. "I have a disruptive passenger in 1A, refusing a direct order from the captain. I want him removed. Now!" He slammed the phone down and looked back at Marcus with a smirk of triumph. "You wanted the hard way," Richard said. "You got it." Marcus didn't speak. He just picked up his pen and opened his notebook again. He wrote 10:55 a.m. Captain invoked authority to remove passenger based on bias. Escalation initiated. He closed the book, sat back, and waited. The storm wasn't outside anymore. It was right here in seat 1A. And Richard Sterling had just walked directly into the eye of it, the arrival of the Port Authority Police Department, PAPD, on a commercial airliner is never subtle. The heavy thud of boots on the jet bridge floor vibrated through the fuselage, signaling the end of civil discourse. Inside the cockpit, Captain Richard Sterling adjusted his tie, checking his reflection in the dark glass of the avionics panel. He looked composed, authoritative, every bit the hero he believed himself to be. He turned to his first officer, Timothy. "Watch and learn, Tim." Richard said, a smug grin playing on his lips. "This is how you maintain the integrity of your ship. You don't let the weeds grow in your garden." Timothy didn't smile. He was staring at the engine indicators, his stomach churning. "Captain, did he actually threaten you? I didn't hear a threat." "Insubordination is a threat to safety, Tim. Don't be soft." The cabin door opened. Two officers, large men with grim expressions and tactical vests, squeezed into the narrow entryway of the first-class cabin. The lead officer, Sergeant Miller, looked around, his hand resting instinctively near his belt. "Where's the problem, Captain?" Miller asked, looking at Richard, who had stepped out to meet them. Richard pointed a dramatic finger at seat 1A. "Right there. Passenger refused a direct order to change seats. He's been hostile, argumentative, and I have deemed him a threat to the safety of this flight. I want him removed immediately." Sergeant Miller turned his gaze to Marcus Hayes. Marcus hadn't moved. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, the very picture of tranquility amidst the chaos. He looked at the sergeant, then back at Richard. "Sir," Sergeant Miller said, approaching Marcus, "the captain has asked you to leave the aircraft. You need to grab your things and come with us." The cabin was dead silent. Senator Corcoran was watching over the rim of his glasses, his face unreadable. The CEO of Oakhaven Tech had her phone out, recording the interaction beneath her tray table. Marcus stood up slowly. He was taller than the sergeant, taller than Richard. He loomed over the seat, his presence filling the cramped space. "I am complying," Marcus said, his voice calm and clear. "I am leaving because I do not wish to delay these passengers any longer than Captain Sterling already has." "Just get your bag," Richard snapped from the galley, unable to help himself. "And save the speech." Marcus reached up and pulled his battered leather duffel from the bin. He slung it over his shoulder. He turned to face Richard. The distance between them was only a few feet, but it felt like a canyon separating two different realities. "Captain Sterling," Marcus said, his voice dropping so only the captain and the officers could hear, "you have invoked 49 U.S. Code 444902 to remove a passenger you deem a risk. That is a heavy sword to swing." "I know the law," Richard sneered. "Get off my plane." "I'm going," Marcus said. He reached into his hoodie pocket. "Don't," Sergeant Miller barked, stepping forward. Marcus froze, then slowly pulled out a business card. He didn't hand it to Richard. He placed it gently on the empty seat of 1A. "You're going to need a lawyer, Richard," Marcus said, using the captain's first name with a familiarity that made Sterling's skin crawl. "And you're going to need a very good union rep, because when I walk off this bridge, the clock starts ticking on your career." "Get him out of here," Richard yelled, his patience snapping. "He's threatening me again. Officer, remove him." Sergeant Miller grabbed Marcus by the elbow. "Let's go, sir. Now!" Marcus didn't resist. He allowed himself to be escorted down the aisle. It was the walk of shame, the moment every unruly passenger dreads, the moment hundreds of eyes judge you as a drunk, a failure, a criminal. But Marcus didn't look down. He made eye contact with the passengers as he passed. He nodded respectfully to the senator. "Apologies for the inconvenience, Senator," Marcus said smoothly. "A shame, truly," the senator murmured, looking confused. He had seen drunks kicked off planes before. This man was stone sober and more articulate than the pilot. Marcus stepped through the aircraft door and onto the jet bridge, the humid air of the tunnel hitting him. The officers flanked him, ready to slap cuffs on him if he twitched. "Am I under arrest?" Marcus asked as they walked up the ramp. "Not yet," Miller said, "but the airline will likely press charges for trespassing or interference. We have to take you to the station for processing." "That won't be necessary," Marcus said, "but you can escort me to the terminal. I have a phone call to make." Back on the plane, Richard Sterling watched the back of the hoodie disappear. He felt a rush of adrenaline, a dopamine hit of absolute power. He had won. He had cleansed his sanctuary. He turned to the cabin, clapping his hands together once. "Ladies and gentlemen, my sincere apologies for that unpleasantness. We have zero tolerance for anyone who disrupts the safety and comfort of our VIP guests. We'll be pushing back in moments. Champagne is on the house for first class." He flashed his movie star smile, but the return was lukewarm. The passengers weren't smiling. They were shifting in their seats, exchanging glances. The vibe in the cabin had curdled. Richard didn't care. He walked back to the cockpit, shutting the reinforced door with a heavy thud. He slid into the left seat and put on his headset. "Door is locked," Richard said to Timothy. "Let's get this bird in the air. Request pushback." Timothy looked pale. "Captain, that guy. The business card he left." "Trash it," Richard said, flipping switches on the overhead panel. "I don't care if he's the Prince of Wales. On this plane, I am God." Timothy hesitated, then reached back and grabbed the card from the empty seat before Sarah could clear it. He glanced at it quickly. It was a heavy, cream-colored card with gold embossing. The Department of Transportation seal was stamped in the center. Marcus Hayes, Executive Director, Field Operations and Safety Compliance, Federal Aviation Administration. Timothy's blood ran cold. His hands started to shake. "Captain, not now. Tim called the tower." Richard throttled up the APU. He was ready to fly. He didn't know that the man he had just kicked off was currently standing in the terminal window phone to his ear, looking directly at the nose of the Boeing 777. The pushback tractor groaned as it lifted the nose gear of Flight 492. The plane began to move backward, slowly retreating from the gate. Captain Richard Sterling felt the familiar vibration of the aircraft and exhaled. This was his favorite moment, the transition from the earth to the machine. The rain was still lashing against the windshield, but Richard didn't mind. He was a good pilot, a great pilot in his own mind. He could fly through a hurricane and not spill his coffee. "Tower Flight 492 requesting taxi to runway 4. "Left," Timothy said into the headset, his voice trembling slightly. There was a pause, a static crackle. "Flight 492, hold position," the air traffic controller replied. The voice wasn't the usual rhythmic, bored cadence of ATC. It was sharp, urgent. "Holding position," Timothy said. He glanced at Richard. "They're holding us." "Probably congestion," Richard scoffed. "With this rain, everyone is backed up. Give them a minute, then nudge them. I want to get out of here before my duty time gets crunched." They sat on the tarmac engines, idling the wipers, slapping rhythmically against the glass. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 5. Richard tapped his fingers on the yoke. "This is ridiculous. Tim, call them again. Tell them we are ready and burning fuel." Timothy keyed the mic. "Tower Flight 492, holding on taxiway Alpha, requesting update." Silence. Then a new voice came over the frequency. It wasn't the tower controller. It was deep, authoritative, and sounded like it was coming from a different room entirely. "Flight 492, this is the tower supervisor. Do not move your aircraft. Kill your engines immediately. Richard frowned. Kill the engines. That was an extreme order. That usually meant a fuel leak, a bomb threat, or a loose gear pin. Tower, say again, Richard interrupted, taking over the radio. This is Captain Sterling. We are perfectly operational. Why are you ordering an engine shutdown? Captain Sterling, shut down your engines now, the supervisor ordered, and hold position. You are being ordered to return to the gate. Ground control has locked your block. Return to gate. Richard shouted, his anger flaring again. We just left. We dealt with the passenger issue. We are clear. Captain, this order comes from the top. Shut it down. Richard slammed his hand against the glare shield. Unbelievable. Probably that idiot in 1A called in a hoax bomb threat. I knew he was trouble. Now we have to get swept by the dogs. He angrily cut the fuel flow levers. The massive GE90 engines spun down the hum, dying away into a sullen silence. The cabin lights flickered as the power switched back to the batteries. Sarah. Richard buzzed the intercom. Prepare the cabin. We're going back to the gate. Security issue. Again. Sarah's voice crackled back, sounding exhausted. The tug driver who had been waiting below reconnected the tow bar. The plane shuddered as it was pushed forward back toward the terminal it had just left. Richard fumed the entire way. He was mentally drafting his report. He would sue that passenger. He would have him buried under legal fees. He would make sure Marcus Hayes never flew so much as a kite again. The plane groaned to a halt at gate B42. The jet bridge began to extend. I'm going to go out there and give the police a piece of my mind, Richard said, unbuckling his harness. They should have arrested him, not let him make phone calls. Captain, Timothy said, his voice barely a whisper. He was holding the business card, his face white as a sheet. You need to look at this. I don't want to see his trash, Tim. Richard. Look at the card, Timothy yelled, cracking for the first time. Richard stopped. He snatched the card from Timothy's hand. He held it up to the dim light of the cockpit. He read the name. Marcus Hayes. He read the title. FAA Director of Field Operations. Richard blinked. He read it again. The words didn't make sense. They couldn't make sense. The guy in the hoodie. The guy in the joggers. That was the man who oversaw the safety regulations for the entire country. No, Richard whispered. This is fake. It's a prop. He's a con artist. But deep in his gut, a cold, hard stone of dread began to form. The cockpit door didn't just open. It was unlocked from the outside. That shouldn't happen. Only the crew had the code. The door swung open. Standing there was not Sarah. Standing there was the airport duty manager, a man Richard knew well, looking terrified. Beside him was a man in a dark suit with an earpiece, federal security. And behind them, stepping onto the plane for the second time that day, was Marcus Hayes. He wasn't wearing the hoodie anymore. He had taken it off to reveal a plain black t-shirt. But around his neck, hanging from a lanyard, he had pulled from his bag, was a badge. A federal badge. It caught the cockpit lights gleaming with authority. Marcus didn't yell. He didn't look angry. He looked like a judge delivering a verdict. He stepped into the cockpit. It was crowded now. Richard was still sitting in his seat, the business card crumbling in his sweaty hand. "Captain Sterling," Marcus said. His voice was no longer the voice of a passenger. It was the voice of the United States government. "You," Richard stammered. "You can't be back here. This is a sterile flight deck." "Not anymore," Marcus said. "As of 2 minutes ago, this aircraft has been grounded by the Federal Aviation Administration, and your medical certificate and pilot's license have been administratively suspended pending an emergency inquiry." Richard felt the air leave his lungs. You can't do that. I'm the captain." "You were the captain," Marcus corrected him. "Now you are a liability." Marcus turned to Timothy. "First Officer Leclerc." Yes, sir," Timothy squeaked. "Did you concur with Captain Sterling's assessment that I was a security threat?" Timothy looked at Richard, then at Marcus. He looked at his career flashing before his eyes. "No, sir," Timothy said instantly. I told him you were platinum. I told him the manifest was clear. He insisted." "Traitor," Richard hissed. Marcus ignored Richard. "Good. You're relieved of duty for the day, Leclerc. Go home." Marcus turned back to Richard. He leaned in close, resting his hands on the backs of the pilot seats. "You called me unfit, Richard. You judged me by my clothes. You judged me by my skin. You thought you were protecting your VIPs from riffraff." Marcus gestured to the window where the rain was still falling. "I wrote the VIP protocols for this airline, Richard. I signed the authorization for the very seat you sat in to learn how to fly this plane. And today, I sat in seat 1A to see if this airline was still prioritizing safety and respect over ego." Marcus paused, letting the silence crush Richard. "You failed," Marcus whispered, "spectacularly." "I was doing my job," Richard shouted, trying to regain some ground. "I have discretion. You were suspicious." "I was sitting," Marcus countered. "And now you're leaving. Law enforcement is waiting at the end of the jet bridge, Richard. But this time they aren't there for me. They're there to escort you off the premises. You are to surrender your badge and your ID immediately." Richard looked at the duty manager. "You're letting him do this. I've flown for this airline for 20 years. The duty manager looked at the floor. "He's the FAA, Richard. He can ground the whole fleet if he wants. Just go." Richard Sterling, the king of the sky, slowly unbuckled his seatbelt. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely undo the clasp. He stood up, his legs feeling like jelly. He grabbed his flight bag. He had to walk out of the cockpit. He had to walk through the first-class cabin. The passengers were still there. They had seen the plane return. They had seen the police board again. And now they saw their captain stripped of his swagger, looking pale and defeated, being escorted off his own plane by the man he had called unfit. Senator Corcoran looked up as Richard passed. The senator locked eyes with Marcus, then looked at Richard with a sneer of disgust. "Unfit indeed," the senator said loud enough for the cabin to hear. Richard kept his head down. He walked into the jet bridge. The officers were there. "Mr. Sterling," Sergeant Miller said, the same officer Richard had summoned earlier. "We need your airport security badge. You're being escorted landside." Richard handed over his badge. He felt naked. He felt small. As he walked up the ramp, leaving the world of aviation behind him, he heard Marcus's voice one last time, speaking to the flight attendant. "Sarah, I'm sorry for the delay. Is there any chance I could get that water now?" "No ice." Richard Sterling kept walking, but he knew with a sickening certainty that he would never step foot in a cockpit again. The sky was closed. The corporate headquarters of Sovereign Airways was a glass monolith in downtown Dallas, a building designed to intimidate. It was a place of sterile corridors, hushed conversations, and career-ending decisions. 3 days after the incident on Flight 492, Captain Richard Sterling sat in a waiting room on the 40th floor. He was wearing his best suit, not his uniform. His uniform had been collected by a courier the previous morning, along with his company iPad and his security clearance badges. Richard stared at a fern in the corner, his leg bouncing nervously. Beside him sat Stan Kowalski, his union representative from Alpa Airline Pilots Association. Stan was a heavy-set man, with a face like a bulldog, usually the kind of guy who could negotiate a pilot out of a DUI charge. Today, however, Stan looked grim. "Stop shaking your leg, Rick," Stan muttered, not looking up from his phone. "They can't fire me." "Stan," Richard said, his voice raspy. He hadn't slept in 72 hours. "I have 20 years. I have a clean record. I was exercising my captain's authority under 14 CFR 91.3. I have the final say on safety." "Rick, shut up," Stan said sharply. "You didn't kick off a drunk. You tried to kick off the FAA's Director of Field Operations because you didn't like his hoodie. Do you have any idea how radioactive you are right now? The airline's stock dropped 4% yesterday when the rumors started." "It's a misunderstanding," Richard insisted, though his confidence was a hollow shell. "I'll explain my thought process. They'll see I was prioritizing the VIPs." The heavy oak doors opened. A young assistant, looking terrified, beckoned them in. "They're ready for you, Captain Sterling." Richard stood up, smoothed his jacket, and walked into the boardroom. It was a massacre waiting to happen. At the head of the table sat Elias Thorne, the CEO of Sovereign Airways. To his right was Captain Vance, the chief pilot, a man Richard had known for years, a man he considered a friend. Vance wouldn't meet his eyes. To the left were 3 lawyers from the firm, Cravath, Swain, and Moore, the company's external legal sharks. And at the far end of the table, sitting alone, was Marcus Hayes. Marcus was wearing a tailored navy suit today. He looked every inch the federal director. He had a thick file folder in front of him. He didn't look angry. He looked clinical. "Sit down, Richard," CEO Elias Thorne said. His voice was cold enough to freeze nitrogen. Richard sat. Stan sat beside him, opening a notebook. "Gentlemen," Stan started, "we are here to discuss the unfortunate misunderstanding on Flight 492. Captain Sterling is prepared to—" "Save it, Stan." Captain Vance cut in. "This isn't a negotiation. This is a notification." Richard's heart hammered against his ribs. "Notification." Captain Vance slid a piece of paper across the mahogany table. "As of 0800 hours this morning, Sovereign Airways has terminated your employment for cause: gross misconduct violation of anti-discrimination policies and unauthorized use of command authority to harass a passenger." "You can't do that," Richard shouted, standing up. "I demand a hearing. I have union rights." "We've already arbitrated with the union board." "Rick," Stan said quietly, pulling on Richard's sleeve. "They waived the hearing. They aren't backing you on this one." Richard looked at Stan, betrayed. "What? But that's the least of your problems," Marcus Hayes spoke up. His voice filled the room, calm and resonant. Marcus opened his folder. "Richard, the FAA has completed its preliminary review of the incident. We pulled the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, and the cabin audio. You can't use the CVR for disciplinary action," Richard argued, citing a well-known pilot privacy rule. "We aren't using it for employment discipline," Marcus corrected him. "We are using it for an emergency order of revocation regarding your airman certificates." Marcus slid a second document across the table. It bore the Department of Transportation seal. "The FAA is revoking your airline transport pilot license, effective immediately. We are also flagging your medical certificate for psychiatric review regarding narcissistic traits and anti-authority impulsivity incompatible with safe flight operations." Richard felt the room spinning. Revocation. Not suspension. Revocation. That meant he wasn't a pilot anymore. He was a pedestrian. He would have to start over from 0 private pilot instrument rating commercial years of training, assuming anyone would even let him fly. "You're destroying my life over a hoodie," Richard whispered. "I'm removing a hazard from the national airspace system," Marcus replied. "I listened to the tape, Richard. I heard you call me boy. I heard you tell your first officer that you were God on that plane." The lawyers flinched. Even the CEO looked uncomfortable. That was out of context," Richard stammered. "It was on tape," Marcus said. "But here is the twist, Richard. The part that really sealed your fate." Marcus leaned forward. "We audited your flight history. The FAA ran a pattern recognition on your passenger removal logs. In the last 5 years, you have removed 12 passengers from first class. Do you know what they all had in common?" Richard went pale. "They were all minorities," Marcus said. "Every single one. You haven't just been protecting VIPs. You've been curating your cabin to match your worldview. That is a violation of federal civil rights laws. The Department of Justice has been notified." The room went deadly silent. This wasn't just about a job anymore. This was about prison time. Civil rights violations in aviation were federal felonies if they interfered with commerce. I want a lawyer," Richard croaked. "You have one," the CEO said, gesturing to Stan. "I'm a union rep, not a criminal defense attorney," Stan said, closing his notebook. "Rick, you're on your own. The union can't touch a DOJ investigation." "Richard Sterling," the CEO said, standing up. "You are banned from all Sovereign Airways properties. Security will escort you to the garage. If you step foot in one of our terminals again, you will be arrested for trespassing." Richard looked at Captain Vance. "Vance, Jimmy, help me." Captain Vance looked at the table. "You dishonored the wings, Rick. Get out." Richard stood up. His legs felt like lead. He looked at Marcus Hayes one last time. Marcus wasn't gloating. He looked sad. "It didn't have to be this way," Marcus said. You just had to fly the plane." Richard turned and walked out of the boardroom a broken man. But as he stepped into the elevator, he pulled out his phone. He still had one card to play. He had the court of public opinion. He would spin this. He would go to the press. He would say he was the victim of a woke government overreach. He dialed the number for the Daily Patriot, a right-wing news outlet known for taking up controversial causes. "Hello," Richard said, his voice trembling with rage. "I have a story for you. A veteran pilot fired for refusing to bow down to a corrupt FAA official. I want an interview. Tonight." He thought he could control the narrative. He didn't know that the internet had already beaten him to it. Richard Sterling sat in his living room, a glass of scotch in his hand, waiting for the reporter from the Daily Patriot to arrive. He had convinced himself that he was the hero. He was the captain who stood his ground. The world would see that. His wife Ellen walked into the room. She was holding her iPad, her face ashen. "Richard," she whispered, "have you seen it?" "Seen what?" Richard snapped. "I'm busy preparing my statement." "Twitter," she said. "TikTok, YouTube. It's everywhere." She turned the screen toward him. It was a video. Vertical format, high definition. It had been filmed by the passenger in seat 1B, the CEO of Oakhaven Tech. She had recorded the entire interaction from beneath her tray table. The video had been uploaded 2 hours ago. It already had 14 million views. The title was simple: "Racist Pilot Tries to Kick FAA Director Off Plane, Instant Regret." Richard watched in horror. The audio was crystal clear. "Listen to me, boy. I am the captain of this vessel. My voice is law. You are unfit for VIP status." The camera zoomed in on Marcus Hayes, calm, composed, dignified. Then it panned to Richard, red-faced, spitting, looking deranged. Then the cut to the aftermath. The police escorting Richard off the plane. The senator's comment, "Unfit indeed." Richard scrolled down to the comments. They were scrolling so fast, he couldn't read them. User 99. Did he really just say, "I am God"? Who is this guy? Flygirl 22. I'm a flight attendant. This guy is a nightmare. Everyone knows Captain Sterling. He's a monster. Legal Eagle. That boy, comment. That's a career ender. That's a lawsuit. Karma Police. The guy in the hoodie is Marcus Hayes. He's the top dog at the FAA. This pilot literally tried to bully his own boss. Ha 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 ha! Richard threw the iPad onto the couch. It's edited. It's out of context. Richard, it's not edited, Ellen said, tears streaming down her face. My sister called. She saw it. The neighbors saw it. There are news vans parking at the end of the driveway. Good, Richard yelled, pacing the room. Let them come. I'll tell them the truth. The doorbell rang. Richard straightened his tie. That's the reporter. Finally. He marched to the door and threw it open. It wasn't the reporter from the Daily Patriot. It was a process server. A young kid in a baseball cap chewing gum. Richard Sterling. Yes. The kid shoved a thick stack of papers into Richard's chest. You've been served. Served for what? Civil lawsuit, the kid said, walking back to his car. Class action, representing the 12 other passengers you kicked off over the years. They saw the video. They recognized you. They're suing for discrimination, emotional distress, and defamation. Oh, and Sovereign Airways is suing you too. Breach of contract and damages for brand reputation. Good luck, buddy. Richard stood in the doorway, the papers heavy in his hands. He looked out at his driveway. The news vans weren't from the friendly outlet he had called. They were CNN, MSNBC, Fox, and BBC. They were camped out like vultures. He saw a reporter standing on his lawn microphone in hand doing a live segment. Richard could hear her through the open air. Captain Sterling, now dubbed the Pilot of Prejudice, is facing a federal investigation and multiple lawsuits. Sources say he has lost his license and his pension is frozen, pending the civil rights inquiry. Pension frozen. Richard dropped the papers. The glass of scotch slipped from his hand and shattered on the porch. His retirement, his savings. It was all tied up in the airline's stock and his pension fund. If they sued him for damages, if they proved he violated federal law, he would lose everything. The house, the boat, the country club membership. He retreated inside and slammed the door. He locked the deadbolt. "Ellen!" he called out. There was no answer. He walked into the kitchen. On the counter was a note. "I'm going to my mother's. Do not call me until this is over. You humiliated us." Richard Sterling was alone. The house was silent save for the ringing of the landline phone, which started then and didn't stop. He slumped onto the kitchen floor, surrounded by the granite countertops and stainless steel appliances he had bought with the money he earned from being a captain. He looked at his hands, the hands that used to control 300 tons of machinery. Now they couldn't even control his own front door. He had wanted to be treated like a VIP. He had wanted the world to respect his authority. Now the world knew exactly who he was, and they had decided he was unfit. 6 months had passed since Flight 492 returned to the gate. The aviation world moves fast, usually burying yesterday's news under today's delays. But the Sterling incident hadn't been buried. It had grown into a movement. At the FAA headquarters in Washington, D.C., the main auditorium was packed. It was standing room only. Pilots, airline executives, and union representatives from every major carrier were in attendance. The mood was somber, respectful. On the stage stood Marcus Hayes. He looked tired but determined. Behind him, projected on a massive screen, was a new document, the Sterling Protocol Bias Recognition and De-escalation in Command Authority. "Command is not a privilege to rule," Marcus said, his voice echoing through the hall. "It is a duty to serve. When we allow our personal biases, our judgments about how a passenger looks, how they dress, or the color of their skin, to override our assessment of safety, we are not just failing as people. We are failing as pilots." He clicked a remote. A photo of a hoodie appeared on the screen. A ripple of nervous laughter went through the crowd. "This is not a threat," Marcus said, unsmiling. "This is a piece of cotton. The threat is the ego that cannot distinguish between a passenger and a prejudice." Marcus looked out at the sea of uniforms. "Effective today, every pilot in the United States will undergo mandatory recertification under this protocol. We are ending the era of the God complex in the cockpit. If you cannot treat every soul on your manifest with dignity, you will not fly in my airspace." The applause started slowly, then grew into a roar. It was a standing ovation. Marcus had turned a moment of ugliness into a legacy of change. Meanwhile, 300 miles away, in Queens, New York, the rain was falling again. It was a cold, miserable Tuesday afternoon outside JFK's Terminal 4. The traffic was gridlocked. Horns were blaring. A white shuttle bus with the logo of the Happy Stay Budget Inn rattled to a halt at the curb. The brakes squealed loudly, drawing annoyed looks from the travelers rushing to check in. The driver's door opened. A man in a cheap, ill-fitting polyester uniform stepped out into the drizzle. He wore a name tag that simply said, Rick. It was Richard Sterling. His hair was no longer perfectly coiffed. It was thinning and grey. The movie star jawline was hidden behind the jowls of a man who had spent the last 6 months stress-eating and drinking cheap beer. He walked around to the back of the bus to unload the luggage. "Hey, driver, heavy bags," a passenger shouted, a young man in his 20s wearing a hoodie and headphones. "Be careful with that guitar case." "Yes, sir," Richard mumbled, keeping his head down. "I've got it." Richard hauled the heavy bags onto the curb, his back aching. He used to command a machine worth $300 million. He used to sip coffee while watching the sun rise over the Atlantic. Now he was lifting suitcases for tourists who didn't even look him in the eye. As he set the last bag down, a group of pilots walked by. They were Sovereign Airways pilots, a captain and 2 first officers. They were laughing, their uniforms crisp, their flight bags rolling smoothly behind them. Richard froze. He recognized the captain. It was Timothy Leclerc. Timothy had been promoted. The young man Richard had tried to bully into silence was now wearing 4 stripes. He walked with a quiet confidence, chatting with his crew. Timothy paused. He looked at the shuttle bus driver standing in the rain. Their eyes locked for a fleeting second. Richard wanted to look away to hide, but he couldn't. He saw the pity in Timothy's eyes. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hate. It was just pity. Timothy gave a small, sad nod, then turned and walked toward the terminal entrance, the automatic doors sliding open to welcome him into the world Richard was banished from forever. "Hey, buddy, you want a tip or what?" the tourist in the hoodie yelled, waving a dollar bill. Richard turned back to the reality he had created. He took the dollar. "Thank you, sir." Richard said, his voice breaking. "Have a safe flight." He climbed back into the driver's seat of the rusted shuttle bus. Through the windshield, he watched a Boeing 737 soar into the grey clouds, banking sharply toward London. He watched it until it disappeared, leaving him behind on the ground, exactly where he belonged. The story of Captain Richard Sterling is a stark reminder that authority is a fragile thing. It is given by the public and maintained by trust. Richard believed his uniform made him invincible, that his title gave him the right to judge others based on appearances. But in the end, it was his own judgment that grounded him. Marcus Hayes didn't just win because he had a higher rank. He won because he had the one thing Richard lacked: humility. The Sterling Protocol serves as a lasting lesson in the aviation industry that the most dangerous turbulence isn't in the air, but in the mind of a pilot who forgets their humanity. Richard Sterling wanted to clear his cabin of unfit people, But the universe has a funny way of balancing the scales. In trying to protect his VIP world, he proved he was the only one unfit to be a part of it. Wow, what a roller coaster. I hope you guys enjoyed this story of instant karma and justice served at 30,000 feet. It really makes you think twice about how we judge people, doesn't it? If you enjoyed this story and want to see more real-life inspired dramas about justice, karma, and the workplace, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever been judged by your appearance only to prove them wrong? Let me know your story down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.